It's October 1702, and the morning sun casts long shadows across the cobblestone streets of Cape Town. In a modest but well-appointed house near the harbor, Maria van de Kaap carefully arranges her household for the day ahead. Her children speak Dutch at breakfast, but their laughter carries the musical tones of Khoikhoi inflection. On the table sits bread, baked in the Dutch tradition, alongside dried fish, prepared using techniques passed down through generations of coastal peoples. Outside, her husband Klaas returns from the harbor where he's been negotiating with ship captains. His ledger, written in careful Dutch script, records transactions that span continents: ivory from the interior, spices from the Indies, wine from local vineyards. But the real complexity of his world isn't captured in any ledger. It's written in the very fabric of his being, in the languages he speaks, the customs he observes, and the community he's helping to build. Down the street, Anna Trinchi adjusts her head wrap, a style that borrows from both Dutch and Malay traditions, before opening her shop. Inside, shelves hold remedies that blend European medical knowledge with indigenous healing practices. Her customers include Dutch settlers, Khoikhoi pastoralists, and the growing population of freed slaves from Madagascar and Bengal. Each brings their own needs, their own knowledge, their own contribution to the emerging tapestry of Cape society. These aren't isolated individuals trying to fit into existing categories. They're part of something unprecedented in the colonial world, the emergence of vibrant, mixed-race communities that refuse to be defined by the simple binaries of colonizer and colonized, European and indigenous, free and enslaved. What's unfolding at the Cape between 1690 and 1720 represents one of history's most remarkable examples of cultural innovation and social agency in the face of colonial transformation. Hello, I'm Dr. Adam Cameron, and this is Missing History Records. These weren't people caught between worlds, they were architects of entirely new worlds. Between 1690 and 1720, mixed-race communities at the Cape developed sophisticated social networks, innovative economic strategies, and rich cultural practices that neither Dutch nor indigenous societies had previously imagined. But who were the pioneering families that laid the foundations for these communities? How did they navigate the increasingly complex racial hierarchies that colonial administrators tried to impose? What unique blend of African, European, and Asian influences shaped their daily lives, their spiritual practices, their economic activities? And why have their stories been reduced to footnotes when they were actually central figures in shaping Cape colonial society? The reality is far more complex and far more inspiring than conventional histories suggest. These communities weren't passive products of colonial encounter, they were active innovators who created new opportunities, challenged social boundaries, and established themselves as indispensable parts of Cape society. From master craftsmen who revolutionized local building techniques, to skilled interpreters who made colonial commerce possible, from cultural innovators who created new forms of music and storytelling, to social entrepreneurs who built networks spanning continents. Their rise fundamentally transformed the Cape Colony, creating social dynamics that would influence South African society for centuries. They developed hybrid languages that facilitated communication across cultural boundaries, religious practices that honored multiple traditions, and social customs that reflected their complex heritage while asserting their own distinct identity. These communities didn't just survive the colonial encounter, they turned it into an opportunity for unprecedented cultural creativity and economic advancement. They became the brokers, the translators, the bridge builders, who made the colonial economy function while maintaining their own agency and cultural integrity. In this documentary, we'll explore how families like the Van de Kaaps, the Trinches, and dozens of others built something entirely new at the southern tip of Africa. We'll meet the community leaders who negotiated with colonial officials, the entrepreneurs who created new industries, the cultural innovators who blended traditions into something uniquely their own. This is the story of how mixed-race communities at the Cape didn't just adapt to colonial society, they fundamentally shaped it, creating a model of cultural innovation and social agency that challenges everything we thought we knew about colonial encounters. To understand the remarkable rise of mixed-race communities at the Cape between 1690 and 1720, we must first grasp the unique circumstances that made their emergence possible. The Cape Colony in this period was unlike any other European settlement in Africa or Asia. It was a place where multiple worlds collided, overlapped, and ultimately created something entirely new. When the Dutch East India Company established a refreshment station at the Cape in 1652, they never intended to create a settler colony. Their goal was simple: provide fresh food and water to company ships traveling between Europe and the Indies. But by 1690, the reality on the ground had evolved far beyond company plans. The settlement had grown into a complex society, where multiple populations intersected in ways that defied simple categorization. The indigenous Khoikhoi peoples, who had inhabited the region for centuries, found their traditional pastoralist lifestyle disrupted, but not destroyed. Rather than simply retreating or submitting, many adapted to the new economic opportunities while maintaining their cultural practices. Skilled in livestock management and possessing intimate knowledge of local conditions, they became essential partners in the colony's development. The Dutch settlers, meanwhile, faced challenges their metropolitan countrymen could never have imagined. Isolated from Europe by months of dangerous sea travel, they had to adapt to African conditions, African labor systems, and African knowledge. Many discovered that survival and success required learning from indigenous peoples and forming relationships that went far beyond simple economic exchange. But the Cape's uniqueness lay not just in Dutch-Khoikhoi interaction. The colony's strategic position on the Indian Ocean trade routes brought a constant flow of people from across the known world. Company ships carried soldiers, sailors, and artisans from various European nations. More significantly, they brought slaves from Madagascar, Bengal, Ceylon, and the Indonesian archipelago. These enslaved peoples brought their own knowledge systems, cultural practices, and survival strategies. By 1690, the legal and social categories that colonial administrators tried to impose Dutch, Khoikhoi, slave, free, were proving inadequate to describe the reality of Cape society. Relationships had formed across these boundaries. Children had been born who embodied multiple heritages. Families had emerged that couldn't be easily classified according to the colonial legal system. The economic opportunities at the Cape further complicated these social dynamics. The colony's growth created demand for skilled artisans, interpreters, traders, and agricultural workers. Success in these roles often depended more on knowledge, skill, and social connections than on racial classification. A skilled carpenter who could work with both European and indigenous building techniques was valuable regardless of his ancestry. An interpreter who could facilitate communication between Dutch officials and Khoikhoi chiefs was essential to colonial administration. The demographic reality of the Cape also shaped social development. Dutch women comprised a tiny minority of the population throughout this period. Dutch men, seeking companionship, domestic partnership, or simply survival, often formed relationships with Khoikhoi women, freed slave women, or women from other non-European backgrounds. These relationships, whether formal or informal, created families that embodied the colony's cultural complexity. The Dutch East India Company's policies inadvertently encouraged this social mixing. The company needed stable, skilled populations to maintain the colony, but couldn't afford to transport large numbers of Dutch families. They therefore developed policies that allowed for manumission of skilled slaves, encouraged intermarriage in certain circumstances, and created legal frameworks that recognized the mixed-race children of these unions. Religious factors also played a crucial role. The Dutch Reformed Church, while maintaining European theological traditions, had to adapt to local circumstances. Missionary activities among the Khoikhoi created new Christian communities that blended Reformed theology with indigenous spiritual practices. The presence of Muslim slaves from the Indies introduced Islamic traditions that would profoundly influence Cape culture. By 1690, these various factors had created a society primed for the emergence of distinct mixed-race communities. The children of cross-cultural unions were coming of age, developing their own social networks, economic strategies, and cultural practices. They possessed unique advantages, intimate knowledge of multiple cultural systems, linguistic abilities that made them valuable as interpreters and traders, and social connections that spanned the colony's diverse populations. The period from 1690 to 1720 would prove to be the crucial decades when these emerging communities solidified their identity, established their economic foundations, and created the cultural innovations that would define them for generations to come. They were about to transform from individuals navigating between worlds into cohesive communities that would fundamentally shape Cape colonial society. The story of the Cape's mixed-race communities begins with families who made choices that seemed impossible within the rigid social categories of European colonial thinking. In 1692, we find Eva Krotoa's daughter, also named Eva, establishing herself as a prominent figure in Cape Town society. Her grandmother had been the famous Khoikhoi interpreter Eva, who married Dutch surgeon Peter van Meerhof. Now, this younger Eva was proving that mixed heritage wasn't a limitation, it was a strategic advantage. Eva van Meerhof, as she became known, possessed something invaluable in colonial society: cultural bilingualism. She moved seamlessly between Dutch colonial society and Khoikhoi communities, facilitating trade relationships that brought prosperity to both sides. Her house became a meeting place where Dutch officials, Khoikhoi chiefs, and emerging mixed-race entrepreneurs conducted business that shaped the colony's economic development. Meanwhile, the Van de Kaap family was establishing patterns that would define mixed-race community life for generations. Klaas van de Kaap, whose name itself reflected his Cape origins, had inherited property from his Dutch father while maintaining strong connections to his Khoikhoi mother's family. By 1695, he had built this dual inheritance into a thriving business empire, one that included livestock trading, wine production, and artisan services. What made Klaas remarkable wasn't just his economic success, but his social innovation. He created employment opportunities for other mixed-race individuals, established training programs that combined European and indigenous techniques, and developed trading networks that connected Cape Town to the interior regions where his mother's people lived. His workshops became centers of cultural exchange, where young people learned not just trades, but how to navigate the complex social landscape of colonial society. The Trinche family represented another model of community building. Anna Trinche, freed from slavery in 1690, used her knowledge of multiple healing traditions to establish herself as one of the Cape's most sought-after medical practitioners. Her success allowed her to purchase property, free other family members from slavery, and create a household that became a center of cultural innovation. Anna's medical practice exemplified the kind of knowledge synthesis that characterized these emerging communities. She combined European medical techniques learned from Dutch doctors with traditional remedies from her Malagasy heritage and healing practices learned from Khoikhoi patients. Her treatment methods were often more effective than purely European approaches because they were adapted to local conditions and drew from multiple knowledge systems. By 1700, these pioneer families had established the foundations for what would become a distinct social group. They had created economic networks that connected different parts of colonial society, developed cultural practices that honored multiple traditions, and built social institutions that served their communities' unique needs. The first decade of the 18th century witnessed an explosion of cultural creativity as mixed-race communities developed their own distinct identity. This wasn't simply a matter of blending existing traditions, it was the creation of something entirely new that reflected the unique circumstances of Cape colonial life. Language became one of the most important markers of this emerging identity. While Dutch remained the official language of colonial administration, mixed-race communities developed their own linguistic innovations. They created a pidgin, one that combined Dutch vocabulary with Khoikhoi grammar and Malay pronunciation patterns. This wasn't broken Dutch. It was a sophisticated communication system, one that allowed speakers to convey complex ideas across cultural boundaries. Jan Wouters, a successful craftsman whose workshops had become centers of community life, exemplified this linguistic innovation. In his daily business, he might speak formal Dutch with colonial officials, switch to Khoikhoi when discussing livestock with pastoralist partners, use Malay when negotiating with Muslim artisans, and employ the community's emerging pidgin when teaching young apprentices who came from various backgrounds. Religious life also became a site of remarkable innovation. While many mixed-race families formally belonged to the Dutch Reformed Church, they developed worship practices that incorporated elements from multiple traditions. Sunday services might include Dutch Reformed theology, but the musical traditions drew from Khoikhoi vocal techniques, Malay instrumental styles, and African call and response patterns. Sarah Kama, who had established herself as a religious leader within the mixed-race community, created worship experiences that spoke to people's complex spiritual needs. Her services acknowledged the Dutch Reformed God while honoring ancestral spirits from various African traditions. She developed prayer practices that combined European and indigenous elements, creating a religious experience that felt authentic to people who embodied multiple heritages. Economic innovation paralleled cultural creativity. Mixed-race entrepreneurs identified market opportunities that others missed because they understood the needs of multiple communities. They became the middlemen who made colonial commerce possible, but they did so on their own terms, building wealth that allowed them to invest in community development. The Van Bengalen family, whose patriarch had been freed from slavery in 1698, created a trading network that connected Cape Town to the interior regions, to the local Malay community, and to visiting ships from the frayed Indies. They didn't just facilitate trade, they created new products that appealed to the colony's diverse population. Their workshop produced furniture that combined Dutch design with Malay decorative techniques and indigenous materials, creating a distinctive Cape style that was prized by wealthy colonists. Marriage patterns within these communities reflected their strategic approach to social positioning. Rather than simply marrying within their own group, mixed-race families carefully considered how marital alliances could strengthen their economic networks, expand their cultural connections, and enhance their social standing. A marriage might unite a successful mixed-race trader with the daughter of a prominent Khoikhoi chief, creating partnerships that benefited both families and strengthened community ties. By 1710, these communities had developed sophisticated social institutions that served their unique needs. They created informal mutual aid societies that provided support during economic difficulties, educational systems that prepared young people for success in colonial society, and cultural organizations that preserved and developed their distinctive traditions. The final decade of our period saw mixed-race communities achieve a level of economic success and social recognition that fundamentally changed their relationship with colonial society. They had moved from being individuals navigating between worlds to becoming essential components of Cape colonial life. The construction boom that transformed Cape Town during this period was largely driven by mixed-race entrepreneurs and artisans. They had mastered building techniques that combined European architectural principles with adaptations for the local climate and available materials. Their workshops trained the next generation of skilled workers, creating a knowledge base that made them indispensable to colonial development. Domingo van Bengalen, whose family had established themselves as master craftsmen, received the contract to build several important colonial structures, including expansions to the Castle of Good Hope. His success wasn't just a personal achievement. It represented the recognition of mixed-race communities as essential partners in colonial development. His workshops employed dozens of skilled workers from various backgrounds, creating economic opportunities that strengthened entire communities. Agricultural innovation provided another avenue for economic success. Mixed-race farmers had developed agricultural techniques that combined European crop varieties with indigenous farming methods and imported techniques from Asia. They were often more successful than purely Dutch farmers because they understood local conditions and had access to knowledge systems that European colonists lacked. The Klaas family, descendants of the pioneering Eva van Meerhof, had built an agricultural empire that included vineyards, grain production, and livestock breeding. Their success came from their ability to combine multiple agricultural traditions, European grape cultivation techniques, indigenous knowledge of local soil conditions, and Asian irrigation methods introduced by enslaved workers from the Indies. Trade networks established by mixed-race entrepreneurs had become crucial to colonial commerce. They maintained relationships with interior African communities that provided ivory, cattle, and other trade goods. They established connections with visiting ships that brought Asian goods to Cape markets. And most importantly, they created distribution networks that moved goods throughout the colony. The social recognition that accompanied economic success was perhaps even more significant than wealth itself. By 1720, mixed-race families were being invited to important colonial social events. Their children were receiving formal education, and their opinions were being sought on matters of colonial policy. They had achieved something remarkable: acceptance as legitimate members of colonial society without abandoning their cultural distinctiveness. This social acceptance wasn't just tolerance, it was recognition of their essential role in colonial society. Colonial officials had learned that effective governance required partnerships with mixed-race leaders who could facilitate communication with various communities. Dutch merchants had discovered that their most successful business partnerships were often with mixed-race entrepreneurs who understood multiple markets. Maria van de Kaap, daughter of the pioneering Klaas, exemplified this new social position. By 1720, she had been appointed as an official interpreter for the colonial government, a position that required not just linguistic skills, but also cultural knowledge and social credibility. Her appointment represented formal recognition of mixed-race communities as essential partners in colonial administration. The period concluded with mixed-race communities having established themselves as a permanent and essential part of Cape colonial society. They had created economic enterprises that generated wealth, developed cultural practices that honored their complex heritage, and built social institutions that served their communities' needs. Most importantly, they had demonstrated that colonial society could accommodate cultural diversity while maintaining social cohesion. By 1720, the mixed-race communities of the Cape had achieved something unprecedented in colonial history. They had not simply adapted to existing social structures, they had created new social possibilities that enriched colonial society while maintaining their own cultural integrity. Their children were growing up with a strong sense of identity, one not defined by what they lacked, but by what they had created. They spoke multiple languages fluently, understood various cultural systems intimately, and possessed skills that made them valuable in diverse economic contexts. They had inherited not just mixed racial ancestry, but a tradition of cultural innovation and social entrepreneurship. The communities they had built would continue to evolve, facing new challenges and new opportunities as colonial society developed. But the foundations they had established, the economic networks, cultural practices, and social institutions would endure and continue to shape Cape society for generations to come. The rise of mixed-race communities at the Cape between 1690 and 1720 had consequences that extended far beyond the borders of the colony and the boundaries of that historical period. These communities had fundamentally altered the social dynamics of colonial society, creating new models of cultural interaction that would influence South African society for centuries. Most immediately, their success challenged the rigid racial hierarchies that colonial administrators tried to impose. The economic prosperity and social recognition achieved by mixed-race families demonstrated that colonial society could accommodate cultural diversity while maintaining stability and prosperity. This wasn't the social chaos that many European colonists had predicted would result from racial mixing. It was a sophisticated society, often more economically dynamic and culturally rich than purely European colonial settlements. The economic impact was particularly significant. Mixed-race entrepreneurs had created industries, trade networks, and agricultural enterprises that became essential to colonial prosperity. Their success proved that economic development in colonial settings required local knowledge, cultural sensitivity, and social networks that transcended racial boundaries. The businesses they established would continue to evolve, but the principles they embodied, cultural synthesis, social entrepreneurship, and adaptive innovation, would remain central to Cape economic life. Their cultural innovations had equally lasting impact. The linguistic developments that emerged from mixed-race communities would evolve into Afrikaans, a language that reflected the cultural complexity of Cape society. The religious practices they developed would influence South African Christianity for generations. The artistic traditions they created would contribute to a distinctive Cape cultural identity, one that honored multiple heritages. Perhaps most importantly, these communities had demonstrated that colonial encounters didn't have to result in cultural destruction or social polarization. They had shown that it was possible to honor multiple traditions while creating something new, to maintain cultural connections while adapting to new circumstances, to achieve economic success while preserving community values. The social institutions they created also had lasting influence. The educational systems they developed would serve as models for later initiatives. The mutual aid societies they established would evolve into more formal community organizations, and the leadership structures they created would shape how mixed-race communities organized themselves in later periods. However, their success also created new challenges. Their prosperity and growing social recognition generated resentment among some segments of colonial society, those who felt threatened by their achievements. The flexibility and adaptability that had once been their strength would now be tested as colonial society became more stratified and racial classifications more rigid. The legal frameworks that had allowed for their rise would also come under pressure. As the colony's population grew and became more diverse, colonial administrators would attempt to draw clearer racial boundaries and enforce more restrictive social categories. The communities that had thrived in the fluid social environment of early colonial life would now have to develop new strategies to hold their place in an increasingly structured system. Their influence on colonial governance was also significant. The partnerships they had formed with colonial officials had shown the value of inclusive governance, one that drew on the knowledge and leadership of multiple communities. This model would inform later approaches to colonial administration, though it would face resistance from those who preferred more authoritarian structures. And the international implications? Equally important. The Cape's mixed-race communities had built a model of colonial society that differed sharply from the plantation systems of the Americas or the trading post colonies of Asia. Their achievements would influence debates about colonial policy, racial classification, and social organization throughout the European colonial world. The 30 years between 1690 and 1720 witnessed one of the most remarkable social transformations in colonial history. At the Cape of Good Hope, mixed-race communities didn't just emerge, they thrived, they innovated, and they fundamentally reshaped colonial society. Their story challenges everything we thought we knew about colonial encounters, racial boundaries, and cultural adaptation. These weren't people trapped between worlds, struggling to find their place in rigid colonial hierarchies. They were creative entrepreneurs, cultural innovators, social architects who built something entirely new. They took the challenging circumstances of colonial life and transformed them into opportunities for unprecedented prosperity and cultural creativity. The families we followed, the Van de Kaps, the Trenches, the Van Bengalens, and dozens of others, created a legacy that extended far beyond their own lifetimes. They established economic enterprises that would endure for generations, developed cultural practices that would influence South African society for centuries, and built social institutions that would serve their communities' evolving needs. Their success demonstrated that colonial society could accommodate cultural diversity while maintaining social cohesion. They proved that economic development required local knowledge, cultural sensitivity, and social networks that transcended racial boundaries. Most importantly, they showed that colonial encounters could result in cultural enrichment rather than cultural destruction. The Cape's mixed-race communities had risen to prominence not by abandoning their complex heritage, but by embracing it. Not by fitting into existing social categories, but by creating new ones. Not by accepting the limitations others tried to impose, but by demonstrating the possibilities that others couldn't imagine. Their story reminds us, history is not just about the actions of colonial administrators, or the resistance of colonized peoples. It's also about the creative individuals and communities who found ways to thrive in challenging circumstances, who built bridges between different worlds, and who created new possibilities for human social organization. Between 1690 and 1720, the mixed-race communities of the Cape accomplished something that still reverberates through history. They showed that diversity could be a source of strength, that adaptation could preserve rather than destroy cultural heritage, and that ordinary people could shape the grand forces of historical change. This is the missing history that deserves to be remembered, not as a footnote to colonial history, but as a central chapter in the story of how human communities adapt, innovate, and create new possibilities, even in the most challenging circumstances.